I think it's like an important subject that is often not talked about enough, and there's a few reasons. The first one is that deployment is actually a very scary process because you're basically removing all of that code that you know actually works, and you're replacing it with new code that might actually be completely broken for all you know. And you're also changing your database schema, you're killing all of your process. You know, it's like probably the one moment in time where things can go wrong with your app. It's not like a random failure in your database server. It's because you're pushing new code that has not been used by users. So it's a major cause of downtime, and it's also a huge waste of time for developers because if you break production, you have to fix it, or if your deployment process is hard to manage, then it's time you're managing your deployment process rather than writing code. So my name is Simon. I'm Mathieu on GitHub and Twitter. I work for Rainforest QA, where we are trying to make testing as easy for everyone. And as part of this, we spend a fair amount of time talking to our customers about testing and how to deploy code to productions, how they handle their staging servers. And you know, we get like a very varied range of response from this, from like, what is a staging server? Like, I just pushed my code to production, to like, yeah, I'm not very happy because I only deploy 20 times per day. So, you know, we have bad stories, and we also get like a lot of cool stories from people who actually have this sorted out very well. And the goal with this talk is to actually present some of the things we've learned by doing this, and also by building our own application. You know, this is a fairly short talk, so I'll go over some stuff quickly, but hopefully you should all learn something about deployment. So the first tip, which is I think the most important thing, like if you get only one thing out of this talk, it should be this. If your deployment process is more complicated than this, you're doing it wrong. Like, if you have a script or multiple scripts to run whenever you deploy things to production, somebody is gonna mess it up. It's very error prone. Just push to Git, use a CI server to run your tests, do your build process, whatever needs to be doing, and then push your code to production. This used to be very difficult to do because you needed like another server, you needed Jenkins or something similar, which is a pain to configure, you needed like ops involved. Nowadays, there's like tons of really good hosted CI. We use Circle CI, we like them a lot. It's probably gonna take, you know, half an hour to get this working with Circle. Very easy. Awesome. Second tip, it's like, might seem quite obvious, but as I said, a lot of people don't have that. Have a staging server and make sure that it's close to production, that it's not running like on very different configuration. From my experience, it's worth spending the extra money to make it like very similar to production, like get another SSL cert, get another domain. Don't try to like, you know, save $8 a year and put in a subdomain and then get some random error later on. Just make it as close as possible. It's definitely worth the money. Again, deployment to it should be very easy. Have a different branch, configure your CI, just push it in GitHub, and you're done. And you know, even better than git push, use pull request to deploy. Just do a pull request from your feature branch to your staging branch to production. The main reason for this is that pull requests are a very good communication tool. Just a push is not, it's not the best way to announce to your team that you're actually deploying. Pull requests are seen by everyone. It's easy to add text to it, and it's easy to integrate with third-party services like HipChat. So you get a notification in your room, everybody knows about it. It's very easy, just do it. Now let's move to some more technical stuff. I want to talk about deploying your code without causing downtime in your application. This is a very vast subject, and I could probably do like an hour-long talk about it. So I'm going to focus on what I think is the aspect of it that is often the most problematic to even experienced developers, which which are migrations. If you're using a relational data store like MySQL or Postgres, running migration is very difficult. Active records also make it more difficult than if you're just using raw SQL, especially when you're doing schema changes. There's a few commands in SQL that will lock tables, or active record will assume things that are no longer true after the migration got run. So one thing to be aware of is the active records column cache if you're using the standard Rails setup. And what that is if you look at this migration here, we're simply like removing a column from a table called users. Very simple. But the problem with this code is that the migration will normally run before the new code is actually live in production. So the old code is still there, and even if it's like a deprecated column and nothing is actually reading or writing to nodes, Active Records builds a cache of a known column when it first starts the application for performance reasons. And that means that every time you do a update attributes or you're trying to save a model, it's going to try to save all the attributes back to the database. So if that migration runs and something else, an old version of your code, try to save to the database, it's going to try to write to that column, you're going to get an exception, it's going to die. So the way to work around this is that you can do your deploy in two phases. First, you add the column, you override the columns method on user, and you basically tell Rails to ignore the nodes column. You deploy that code first, and now nothing is actually using the nodes column, and Active Records won't try to write to it. And then you can run the migration after, and you can afterwards just delete that, go back to normal behavior, and that's all there is to it. Another tip that it seems few people are aware of, that migration I had was actually bad practice. Deleting column is not a really great idea because it's impossible to truly roll back because the data is gone. So even if you recreate the same column, you don't have the data. So what I usually do is I just rename the column to deprecated underscore the name of the column underscore a timestamp of when I've done it. I add a timestamp so that I know if something has been deprecated for a month, then I can probably safely delete it because this data, there's no way we're going to roll back a month-old database. Adding indexes, that's another problem. It is worse in certain databases, but the main issue here is that if you have a table with a lot of data and you add a new index, because sometimes you just have to do that, MySQL, at least, will lock the entire table for the duration of the index creation. Sometimes this can take hours. So, and usually large tables are large because you write to them very often. So it's probably not a good idea to lock the entire thing. So how to get around this? Well, if you're using Postgres, it's very easy. You just add the concurrently option to the create index statement, and you're done. It's going to create the index in the background, and it's eventually going to move over to the new index. Not much to it. If you're using MySQL, however, you're not as lucky. MySQL doesn't support creating indexes in the background. There are ways around this using different tools. Percona Toolkit is apparently a very good one. I've never used it personally. I've used the other one, which is an open source project by Facebook called Online Schema Change. This is a very scary thing to do in production, by the way. The way the schema changer tool will work is that it's going to take your table, it's going to create a temporary copy of that table with all the same columns. It's going to add the index on the column on the empty table, so it's going to be very quick. It's going to then start copying all the data from the old table to the new one. But then that process can take hours. So there might be new data added to it. So what it does is that it tells the MySQL replication log, and basically will replay the replication log on the new table, and then it's going to basically converge to a state where the two tables are basically clones of each other. When it reaches that point, it basically locks the old table, renames it to something else, and then renames the temporary table to be the name of the old table. So now that you have a table that is exactly the same as the previous one, but with the index added. This is written in PHP, and it's not a command line tool, so you actually have to script this in PHP. It's not fun to use. For having used it many times, it works. I've never had an issue with it, but I was scared shitless every time I used it. Do this in staging first, because it's a very weird tool, and it's kind of like black magic. It's like a 10,000 line of PHP in like one file, whatever. So I've never had an issue with it. It works. It takes a while to understand how it works. But sometimes it's the only way, unless you want to pay for like 10 hours of downtime to add a new index to your database. So renaming columns, well, my advice is don't do it. This is like obviously not always possible, but there's renaming column is kind of like a pain in the ass, because you need to if you want to do it without downtime, you have to do a bunch of tricks to get things to work. And if you're using active record, often you can get away with not renaming the attribute, keeping the old column name and just having like a virtual attribute and write to the virtual attribute rather than the actual attribute. If, sometimes you don't have a choice. For instance, I worked on a project once where we migrated from I don't remember what, but to some like an authentication system to Devise, and Devise needed a very specific column name for the authentication token. So we actually had to rename that column. So what we did, and that project is open source, we wrote a gem called No Downtime Migrations. And what this does is it allows you to create a mirror column. So it basically adds a new column to your database with the new name you want. It sets up triggers so that if you write to the old one, it copies the data over to the new one. And if you write to the new one, it copies the data back to the old one. And then it also starts a synchronous copy of all the data from the old column to the new column, so that they're now all in sync. And basically, once you're done with that, you can deploy the new code that uses the new column, and then delete the old one like you would normally. Not a easy process, but it works. And if you cannot afford downtime, it's the only way I've found to do it. Something a little more fun now. Having a staging server is nice, but what would be much better is that if you could have a on-demand staging server, so that if you have 5 developers, they each get their own staging server, or something that we've built internally at Rainforest, which is called Fourchette, which means fork in French, is basically a tool that will create you a new Heroku environment for each pull request you make. So the way this works is that it leverages the Heroku fork command, and every time you make a new pull request against our development branch, on any feature branch basically, it forks our staging server on Heroku, creates a new one, and then once the new staging server is up, it posts a comment on the pull request saying, here's the URL for your new staging environment, and then we can go in there and test the code. And it's also like incredibly valuable when there's a UI change, because I don't know about you, but I know CSS pretty well, but if I look at a pull request that is purely CSS change, I don't know if it actually looks good or not. And it's also, there's no clash when you want to test the staging server, and you might be doing something weird because you're doing a load test and you don't want to affect the rest of your team. So that's something we built, and it's working pretty well for us. It's obviously more difficult if you're not on Heroku, but it's, if you're using Chef or Puppet provision servers, it's clearly possible to do on EC2 or even with like with any provider you want. You just need to be, to invest some times in this and be creative. There's many more things I wish I had time to cover, but unfortunately this is supposed to be a lightning talk. But if you have like any deployment issue or you're like not sure about your deployment process, please come and talk to me after the talk. Russell, who's my coworker, is also here, and we love, as I said, that's our business, so we love to hear about the problems people are having, and we'll be like happy to help. So in conclusion, CI should be the only thing deploying your code. It's also extremely valuable because there's no like access to give to people. Our interview process, when we do interviews, we often bring people in for like a week for a trial before we hire them. So these people can deploy without actually getting access to our servers like they would if we were giving them like Capistrano access or something like that. It's very easy, not that difficult to set up. Deploying without downtime is clearly possible. It's more work. You kind of have to decide if you're willing to pay for, if it's fine for your business to have like a few seconds of downtime every time you deploy. My recommendation would be don't do it because it's too much burden on the developers. If you're working on a like highly available product, you clearly have to do it. There's a lot of documentation online around this. There's also been a few talks, even at this meetup, detailing this in a lot more than I have. And finally, I think you should like all invest in your deployment process because it really pays off, and it's one of these things where you can just put in a few hours and you'll save like a lot of time for your entire team.